The wrangling on Capitol Hill has to do with the border wall and what could happen when the House tries to override the president's veto. Let's bring in Democratic Virginia Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger. She sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is a member of the Blue Dog Democratic Coalition, and is a former CAA officer. Congresswoman, welcome to Fox News Channel.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Good to have you. What is the message if the House does not have the votes? I mean, it seems clear that they will not be able to override the president's veto.
Well, in our first vote, it was a bipartisan vote. There were Republicans and Democrats who voted essentially to stand up for constitutional authority that Congress has. And this vote, as I see it, as I voted, was to assert the fact that constitutionally it's Congress that has the power of the purse. And we did our job. We had a bicameral, bipartisan group of lawmakers get together to address the concerns of the border, allocating money for a wall, for fencing, for more immigration judges, for more Customs and Border Patrol agents, for greater technology to be used at our ports of entry. And, you know, in all of the gridlock that we see in Washington, we actually had Congress do its job, come forward with a bipartisan appropriations bill that we passed, the president signed. And so for them to see him take the next step of ordering an emergency order, it's a clear step around Congress's constitutional authority under Article 1 of the Constitution to be the one that has the power of the purse. And we've seen Republicans and Democrats alike assert this same point. So I think it is disappointing that the president did veto this resolution, and I, look forward to having conversations with my colleagues about what the next steps are.
Well, as you know, the president didn't think that the Democrats ponied up enough. He wanted $5.7 billion, and then that went up for the wall. That he thinks that there should be more funding for the wall. What about that?
Well, and I understand his position, and this is something that we've talked about quite extensively. And as you mentioned in the introduction, my background is that of national security. I was a case officer with the CIA. I worked narcotics cases. I worked counterterrorism cases. I worked issues recognizing the threats that are posed at our borders and ports of entry, working to keep the American people safe. And there are many loud voices within Congress that have said we want to have a strong, secure border and a strong, secure point of entry system. But it is a lot more than just a physical barrier along the border. And we do have miles upon miles of physical barrier at the border already. We allocated funding for additional miles of infrastructure, be it wall, be it fencing, depending upon the needs of law enforcement at the border. But it really comes down to how are we best looking at the way to protect our border, and it is through technology. It is through a smart wall, if you will, and it is through greater personnel along some of the points in the border. I mean, there are points along the border where it takes hours for someone to respond, and so we need greater technology. We need greater infrastructure, and these are conversations we've been having certainly since my arrival in Congress in January. But before that, those conversations were being held in a bipartisan manner. The last Congress, there was a good bill that was put forward that would have directed a tremendous amount of money towards border security, but also recognize the fact that if we're going to truly make smart decisions about keeping our border safe, we need to recognize what the real threats are and address them appropriately.
But and then, as you know, the president's plan, what's put forward by the CBP, does call for that 2,800 more agents, 100 more judges, and there's something I always bring up, which I don't understand. In 2006, Democratic leaders supported the Secure Fence Act. That called for 654 miles. The president wanted one-third of that, about 234. The CBP now is calling for just 55 miles, even less than that. $1.38 billion in the first year for just 55 miles. And there is that perception that Democrats are against this. They supported the Bush and the Obama border barriers, but not the Trump one, because it is this president, and the need is still the same, but they're against it because they're against this president.
Well, and in the appropriations bill that we voted for, the bipartisan bicameral bill that was put forward, we did allocate the money for the border wall as requested by CBP. It was $1.3 billion in order to build that infrastructure, be it wall, be it fencing. And so we did take the step forward. Congress did, the House and the Senate, and the president signed it into law. I think a necessary part of this conversation is that since 2016, we have been building infrastructure along the southern border. I think sometimes that gets lost in this conversation, that while we're talking about what to do into the future, we have been building infrastructure along the southern border, be it a wall, be it a fencing, depending upon the needs and the terrain. Ukraine. And so we have made progress on securing the physical infrastructure of the border. And we did vote on that $1.3 billion addition within that appropriations bill to fund fencing and border wall, in addition to more CBP officers, more immigration judges, greater technology to be used at the border, so that we have a more holistic approach and one that is, frankly, more effective than just a piece of infrastructure.
Well, I mean, the president doesn't want just a piece of infrastructure. I mean, finally, how do you think this will resolve? I mean, there are the plans for, obviously, the more high-tech security, but also the president is insisting, and will continue to do so, to build a physical barrier.
Well, and I think that this is a place where he needs to continue the conversations with Congress, and taking the step of creating an executive order is a clear overstep of congressional authority. And my concern, frankly, is that when we're looking at the larger scale, the separations of power as they are in existence and as they were put in place by our founding fathers, what is the next place where we'll see an executive order mandating dollars spent that haven't been allocated by Congress? And frankly, in the executive order, the billions of dollars that the president is allocating has to come from somewhere, and it's coming from our Department of Defense budget. And so, as a representative of Central Virginia, it's coming from our national security funding. It's coming from a place where we're going to have to reallocate dollars because we are.
And how do you feel about that? What if it's being siphoned out of defense issues?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously concerning, because Congress had previously appropriated those dollars because we felt that they were necessary, and to see, billions of dollars pulled out of our defense budget to be allocated towards something that Congress hasn't approved to fund is a terrible precedent to set, but it is also undermining our security elsewhere.
Abigail Spanberger, a newly elected Democratic representative from Virginia, member of the Blue Dog Commission, and former CIA officer. Thank you for joining us here
for having me on, Eric.
Fox News Channel, and thank you for your service in the CIA, of course, to our country, of course.